Good afternoon and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Jason Marzak, Vice President and Senior Director of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center here. As part of our continued focus on economic policy and how to accelerate the region's economic growth, I'm absolutely pleased to be partnering with the World Bank today in its launch of their semi-annual Latin American Caribbean Economic Review titled Competition: The Missing Ingredient for Growth. Today we will highlight new ideas that will help to hopefully further advance a regional economic growth strategy that is tied to our broader Proactive LAC series. It's a series that provides insight to countries across the region on how to emerge stronger from the pandemic and also leap forward in the region's development. We here see economic growth as critical for more prosperity for citizens all across the region that will ultimately help to lift votes from Mexico to Chile. As well, growth impacts citizens' votes, helping to define political outcomes across the region. Just in the last few weeks, we've seen elections in Mexico, Dominican Republic, where economy was part of the decision that voters had when they went to the ballot boxes, and ballot boxes in which they also moved against the anti-incumbency trends that we had seen historically. From today's election cycle, we see that the economy matters. However, despite optimistic cases, the World Bank finds that Latin America and the Caribbean has shown less economic dynamism than any other region in the world. The World Bank report being launched today forecasts that regional GDP will expand by only 1.6% this year, with GDP growth of 2.7 and 2.6% for 2025 and 2026. These rates are the lowest compared to all other regions across the world, and as the bank notes, insufficient to drive poverty. Despite solid macroeconomic management in many parts of the region, prospects for growth remain low, partially because of long unaddressed structural issues. Now, one such issue identified by the report is the low level of competition and the consequences for economic competitiveness. So what is the relationship between competition and economic competitiveness? How can governments and business work together to craft a framework that is conducive to higher competitiveness? To delve into these issues, I'm going to begin with a 15-minute conversation with the chief economist for Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank, Bill Maloney. Bill is one of the foremost economic thinkers of the region. Bill, I'm adding that to your title. He is also a great partner of the Atlantic Council, who leads, among other things, the World Bank's thinking on addressing the structural challenges impairing growth in the region. After my conversation with Bill, Juan Carlos Lopez, chief correspondent for CNN in Espanol here in Washington, will moderate a conversation with Marcela Melendez, Santiago Leve, Leticia Osadasa, and Andrea Budelman. So, Bill, let me start with you. It's great to have you here with us.
Thanks very much for the invitation, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for hosting us.
Oh, great to be co-hosting with you, Bill.
Excellent.
As we're launching this report, I want to take a step back. The report has a couple chapters. I'm sure many in the audience have read the report and seen the different chapters. But Chapter 1 addresses some of the cross-cutting economic challenges facing the region. And I'll note that the report begins by reconciling the fact that Latin America has fully recovered GDP lost during the COVID pandemic. Total employment is close to full recovery, although not in all groups, and poverty has fallen below its pre-pandemic level. Yet the region still confronts a global environment that is very difficult. What are some of the general economic trends that you're seeing in the region as they relate to economic growth? And also, why is the region stalling in comparison to other parts of the world?
Right. So, as you noted, the Latin American and Caribbean Economic Review comes out every 6 months. Yes. And the first chapter precisely deals with the more conjunctural elements, how the region is doing, both with respect to itself and to other regions. And as you say, the picture is very mixed. On the one hand, in terms of macroeconomic management, it's been doing rather well. Inflation, for instance, is below that of the OECD, and that's due to the very early and determined actions on the part of the central banks of the region when they saw that inflation was going to be a problem, long before the Fed ramped it up. So that's a testimony to the increased professionalization and competence of the macroeconomic authorities in the region, and it's something we need to defend as a region. On the other hand, we're not growing. I think our figure at the time was 1.6% for this year. I think it might ease up a little bit because some countries have been performing better over the last couple of months. But that's still nowhere near enough to alleviate poverty and facilitate economic mobility. And it's also not recent in the sense that we look at the 2010s, the region was growing at about 2.2% when the world was growing at 3.1%. So we're consistently underperforming, and that is a combination of, well, in the short run, it's a combination of weak commodity prices, low growth in Europe and the United States, uncertain growth in China. But in the longer term, there are structural issues of many different kinds that get in our way, ranging from education problems to infrastructure problems to the structure of our social protection systems to, and in this particular case, we focus on the competitive environment that our countries operate in.
Structural issues. So that chapter 1 then leads to chapter 2, where you look at competition trends across markets in the region, and you find that is a major contributor to this stalling of growth. I think you also make an important point in the report, which is that the lack of competition leads to higher cost for lower quality goods and services, which also thereby then contributes to higher inequality, right? So that reverberating effect that has across economies. So on a conceptual level, why is competition so important for markets? And how have you decided to begin to further tackle this issue?
So competition among firms, both domestic and international, has a lot of potential benefits. In the first place, it lowers prices to consumers. And so this has a direct impact on poverty and the basket of goods that the poor consume. If it's cheaper because of more competition, that works with us in terms of reducing poverty. From a growth point of view, competition weeds out weaker firms that are maybe absorbing resources that could be better used by more productive firms. It also allows intermediate inputs, higher quality intermediate inputs, to be available to precisely those more productive firms and helps them become even more productive and grow faster. And finally, competition is a stimulus to innovation in principle. I mean, if you have to compete with a bunch of other guys, you are going to try to be on your game. And if you don't have to compete the way, in many cases, we don't have to, then you don't have to do very much to keep your market.
Right. Well, I want to go back to innovation and some of the trade-offs as well that are noted in the report. But as you note as well, competition is a necessary feature to achieve greater efficiency. It's important, as I mentioned, for lower costs, ultimately greater choice for consumers as well. But the ultimate goal should also be to achieve more competitive economies writ large. And this sometimes means bridging this gap between competition and competitiveness, two distinct issues. How can we translate competition into greater competitiveness for the region, and also do so in a way that some of the firms that rely upon lower competition and those jobs are not displaced in the interim?
Okay, so in the first place, exactly that, stimulus to innovation and to pushing the better firms to become even more productive. These are all issues that lead directly to our firms being more competitive. So productivity is effectively competitiveness. Now, what we found is that if you increase competitiveness in the domestic economy, that leads to unambiguous benefits in terms of greater productivity, greater sales, higher wages for workers in those firms. It gets a little bit trickier when you look at competition internationally. There, it's the firms that are already kind of close to the world levels of productivity that innovate to escape that competition and really benefit from it. The problem is that firms that are less close in terms of productivity, and that can be a result of weak management skills, a weak workforce, poor infrastructure, difficult business rules within countries. All those things make our firms less productive and less competitive, and therefore, when they're confronted with competition from China or from wherever else, less able to compete.
And so what's the policy mix that's necessary then to upgrade firm level productivity and make those firms have the greater opportunity to be able to bridge some of those technological frontiers and be able to compete on a global scale?
Right, so you need to work on several fronts at once. And in the first place, studies of management quality in the region suggests that our managers have some work to do in order to get to the global frontier in terms of skills and in terms of having a very competitive attitude towards the rest of the world. So working on firm capabilities is important. But on the other hand, you need the entire system in which they work, the supporting institutions, be they universities, think tanks, or whatever, and then all the relative regulations and labor law around them. All those things are very important to having our firms being more productive and hence more competitive. So it's actually a big agenda.
Yeah, it is.
And one can say on the one hand, okay, we just need more competition. That's true,
Yeah.
except we need to work on all those other things that hold our firms back.
And probably also work on those other things in a sequential manner, right? Because not all can be done, or in a complementary manner, because not all can be done at the same time. So how do you prioritize all that needs to happen to increase competition?
Right. Well, you have to identify the ones which are most binding in any particular moment. And that varies by country.
Yeah. So, Bill, we always hear you to make policy recommendations that are actionable for policymakers. And after our conversation, Juan Carlos Lopez will delve into some of the nitty-gritty, our experts in the following panel. But I want to also hear your perspectives on actionable policies. You just mentioned a few different steps that can be taken, but actionable policies that policymakers across the region, or maybe in specific countries, can take to foster economic competitiveness through competition policies. What are some of your primary recommendations here?
So I think the report provides some of the first evidence on the positive impact of domestic competition authorities, namely where domestic competition authorities have been more aggressive in enforcing antitrust laws and the like. We actually see precisely this increase in productivity, in sales, in wages. And so that's unambiguously good, and that means we should be strengthening those authorities, which tend to be underfunded and less independent than they should be. So that's a place to start. And when you get firms more competitive domestically, that also helps prepare them to be more competitive internationally. So that's one aspect. I would say this emphasis we put on firm upgrading is important, and then the overall ecosystem that they work with. Find the ones which are most binding in each particular region or whatever, and work with the firms and find out which are the barriers that are most preventing them from improving.
The report also mentions, as I was alluding to earlier, the trade-offs that are inherent, right, insofar as protecting existing jobs and firms, but doing so at the cost of foregrown growth. How do you move forward on some of these different policy recommendations in this bridge between what's necessary at domestic and international level, with this knowledge of kind of existing jobs and firms that are dependent in many ways on the lack of competition? Right.
I mean, it is the nature of economic growth that at any period of time, some firms are growing and some firms are contracting. That's exactly what we call creative destruction, and we can't be stopping that. We want to progress. My favorite example is the Ford Falcon in Argentina, which was still produced in Argentina 15 years after it was terminated here. Why could it do that? Because there was no competition. If we had more competition and allowed in Mitsubishi and Toyota and all that, would those workers lose their jobs? Yes. That is a fact. On the other hand, there's a huge trade-off there. So the way we have to do that, on the one hand, we have to have this openness to competition and prepare people to adapt to this to competition. On the other hand, we have to have a very well-designed social protection system that allows workers to move to new positions or to new jobs, retraining, whatever. That needs to be part of the practice. At present, our systems of social protection are not really well designed for that.
And you also mentioned the structural issues that have to go alongside the ramping up of firms to be more competitive, and that thereby goes with the workers too, and as far as training workers for the next generation of job positions.
Absolutely. Latin America still lags in basic measures of mathematical ability for 10th graders, but substantially behind Asia, right? So when we think of, for instance, nearshoring, if I have a choice to go to Vietnam or to Mexico at this point, you would go to Vietnam because the scores are substantially better. So, productive firms need to have productive and well-trained workers. It's good for everybody. They get higher wages, they have more opportunities. So we need to work on that.
And we do a lot of work here. We have a whole working group dedicated to nearshoring. There's actually a subsection of Chapter 1, I believe, focused on nearshoring. What are some of your initial takeaways?
Right. It's actually a very cloudy picture right now, because if you look at the numbers, there is not a huge flow back from Asia towards Latin America. Even in Mexico, we're still below where we were in 2010 in real terms, and flows still continue to Asia. On the other hand, when you talk to people on the ground in the north of Mexico, they say there's a huge demand for industrial real estate and the like. So we have to see what's going on. But at present, both the aggregate FDI numbers and the announcements of greenfield investment are not showing huge movements.
Bill, last question for you before turning to the panel. You mentioned before the importance of innovation, and that is an important issue. Raise the necessary to foster greater innovation of industries. How can innovation policy be designed in a way that contributes more to economic competitiveness? Is that how do you do that along the value chain as well?
Right, so that's critical. And at present, I'd say that in the region, our innovation systems tend to be fragmented, underfunded, and disarticulated. For instance, Latin America, I think, is tied for Africa with the level of interactions between universities and the private sector and firms. That's, if you think of Silicon Valley or Route 128, that linkage between Stanford and Berkeley or Harvard and MIT and the local firms there, that's absolutely critical. And we have some of our smartest people in universities, and they're not talking with the private sector. That's a luxury we can't afford. And I would also say that our training systems need to be more aligned with the needs of the private sector, and we need to be thinking about schools that provide technical training, which is the lifeblood of a modern economy, but we don't really have that. So there are a whole bunch of things we need to do to reform. I would call them second-generation reforms, and we're putting out a publication in a couple months on this. Second-generation reforms of the innovation systems of our countries are absolutely key.
We'll look forward to having you back and talking about that publication when it comes out. You also gave a lot of great insight for now the panel to have to address in further detail.
They can go and correct my mistakes.
As Juan Carlos moderates that. So I want to, again, congratulate you, Bill, and your incredible team on a great report. And thank you again, as always, for the partnership with the World Bank. For our audience, those watching virtually, you'll now see a brief video. For those here in person, I'll welcome Juan Carlos Lopez and his panelists to the desk here, and you'll also see a brief video as they're taking their seats. So again, Bill, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jason. Thanks.
Thank you.
Muy buenas tardes. A pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be with this group and with our guests. So let's go straight to the introductions and the questions. Sitting next to me, immediately next to me, is Marcela Melendez, Columbia National Deputy Chief Economist at the Latin American and Caribbean Chief Economist Office of the World Bank. Before joining the World Bank, she served as Chief Economist for the LAC region at the United Nations program UNDP, where she led knowledge production to support policy design and decision-making in the region. We also have Leticia Osa Daza. She's the head of Latin America practice and a partner in the Mergers and Acquisitions Group. For over 2 decades, Leticia has advised international and domestic clients on successful mergers and acquisitions and other complex cross-border corporate transactions. We also have Santiago Levy, who is a non-resident senior fellow with the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings. He was previously president of the Latin America and Caribbean Economic Association. From 2008 to 2018, he was a vice president for sectors and knowledge of the Inter-American Development Bank From 1994 to 2000, he served as Deputy Minister at the Ministry of Finance and Public Credit of Mexico. And joining us remotely, we welcome Andrea Buttelman. She has had a long and outstanding career in the area of competition and economic regulation, both in the public and private sectors. She was a judge at the Chilean Competition Tribunal and president of the Antitrust Preventive Commission, head of the Regulation Division at the Ministry of Economy, leading the drafting of regulations for public services and overseeing tariffication processes in energy, water, and telecom. Welcome all. Let's start with Marcela, co-author of the report. So I saw a quote, and it's not from Karl Marx, and it says that capitalism without competition is exploitation. And this was a quote by President Biden in his State of the Union address. Where I want to go with this is, when you look at the report, you see a need for these policies, but there's a resistance to it. So what specific policies do you think should be considered to be implemented to contain big business, the political power they have, and the apprehension they have of letting go? What do you do?
Thank you for this question. Indeed, the concentration of economic power translates very often into political power and the capacity to influence policymaking in directions that not necessarily look for the public good. So one thing that we're pointing at in the report is the need to think what to do to somehow rebalance power. One side of it, of course, has to do with having working competition policy and competition institutions, competition laws and agencies which are still young in the region and still weak, very often under-resourced in terms of their staffing and in terms of their funding, and also very often weak in terms of lacking the capacity to actually translate into enforcing good behavior. We have lower sanctions than in other places in the world, and we don't have enough capacity to prosecute and to investigate everything that goes on. So that's one part that for sure has to do with also controlling the political power, because as I was saying, this economic power that you gain in the market translate into rent-seeking behaviors, which is what I am going to go into right now. When you think about rebalancing power, there are policies in other areas that we should be looking at. For instance, regulating lobby behavior and the way business interacts with government officials and with Congress. Also, campaign financing is another way to somehow control and mitigate the way that business has of influencing policy in undesirable ways. And last but not least, there is an ongoing global conversation about how to tax the super rich. The region is starting to take part on it. And that's part of the story, because the idea is that we should have, of course, fair reward for productive activity in the market, but we shouldn't allow rents that are not directly resulting from productive, like rents, as we call them, that come from the exercise of or abuse of market power, and that translate into all these possibilities to influence policy in other directions. The existence of this weakness that I was talking about of competition policy institutions in many countries is in itself sometimes the response of this business political power that has not allowed these institutions to appear sometimes and to function as they should. One thing that we should be also thinking about when we think about these competition policy institutions is the institutional design. In many countries, it's the president who names the directors or the leaders of these competition policy institutions. And when this happens very often, when there is an intervention that touches big interests, then the head of the competition agency is easily removed. This is something that acts exactly against the way we should expect this type of institutions to work with.
So it's a change of the ship. Andrea, you've seen it real time. You've dealt with it. So how does it work? How do you go from competition to competitiveness, and how do you convince this private sector of the benefits of opening up? Oh. we're not hearing you. So, Andrea, we're not hearing you. So we're going to sort out the audio.
I'm
Oh,
here.
I think we hear you now.
Yes. Yeah. In Chile, we have gone a long way. I think we have been the first in the continent to have a modern competition law. We have independent judges. We have an independent prosecutor. We have never had a prosecutor change for political reasons. They all end up their period. So I don't think independence is a problem. Budget sometimes is a problem for the prosecutor. We would like to see a prosecutor that goes against more cases, that doesn't choose the winner-only cases. But when we tell them that, they say we don't have budget. So we have to choose. So I think budget is a thing. And of course, punishments are a big thing. You have to detect the cartels, so don't rates. It's very important. I think most countries have that. Fines, the level of fines are very important. We have been winning, like the right to put higher fines in Chile because of the very, I'd say, responsible way the tribunal has used them. So first we have very low fines, then they increase it, but still they have a ceiling independent of the size of the company. And now we have finally a variable calculation of fines depending on the size of the sales or the profits of the firm. So I think it's a slow process too, so people understand that the competition authorities won't go crazy. So we get more and more power as we are very responsible using it. So finally, in Chile, we have criminal punishment for cartels. Nobody has gone to jail yet, but it's there. Social disapproval, I think it's very important. We have gone from business as usual. People say, well, but that's the way to compete. And now it is an embarrassment, the social embarrassment, and the business associations are being more and more vocal against this kind of practices. Leniency is a very important tool too. Coordination between regulators and competition authorities is very important because regulators usually care more about the stability of the firms they control, they regulate, and not as much as on competition. So I think more coordination is important. And one specific topic, but it's very important, and we haven't touched it well in Chile yet. We have done some things, but we are not there yet. It's better systems for designing the bidding rules of government procurement. And many times, sometimes because of ignorance, sometimes because people want to favor specific companies, these bidding rules are not very competitive. So that's a problem too. Now, you have to know your markets. It's not the big rules, the overall rules are very important, but to know how the markets work, what are the barriers, and what are not the natural or legal barriers, but the barriers that the incumbent build to protect themselves from competition. You have to understand it and go straight to eliminate them. If I may, you can if I'm going too long, okay? But one thing we have in Chile, and I'm not sure other countries do, is we have we call it instrucciones de carácter general, general instructions, which the private persons have to abide. And we can, I mean, the tribunal can dictate these rules if they don't go against the law or against any rulings or soft law. So we did that, for example, in the off-net, on-net tariffs, telecommunication tariffs, like the tariffs, if you call within your network provider, were very low, but if you call another network of the competition of a person that is in the competitor network, they would be very expensive. So there was a lot of switching cost and tariffs wouldn't go down. So when we decided that there couldn't be any difference between off-net and on-net tariffs and number portability was introduced too, we had a fourth competitor coming into the market and dramatic fall in mobile phone tariffs. So that's one example of knowing the markets and go and fix what's going wrong.
Andrea. So I want to go to Leticia. So you're on the other side. You're dealing with these companies, you're representing them, you speak with them. And you told me something when we sat down, I asked you what you thought, and you said, you're optimistic. You're a lot more optimistic than the report is. Why?
Look, I'm originally from Colombia. And I feel the reason why I created the Latin American practice is because I'm very bullish. Because of the opportunities. Yes, we need to work on many structural issues, and I think Red Report highlighted many of those. I also believe that nearshoring, even with the work that has to be done on infrastructure, also dealing with political and legal instability and underskilled workforce, there is a potential. As a region to really overcome those issues. We have been discussing about the regulators, like the authorities on the antitrust side and all the laws. Also, those are, and Marcela mentioned, quite new in the region compared to the US and Europe. But the independence of these institutions is key, and reinforcing that is very important. But we saw it with Lava Jato, the cooperation among authorities to deal with that, to prosecute, was there. So I do believe, and we have already talked about cooperation, we have already talked about the importance. These issues are not also issues that happen in one country. We have more multi-Latinas, so these issues are happening in all the region, also in the US and also in Europe, right? So that cooperation to me is really key, and the way I see really the region overcoming all the structural issues that are highlighted by the report is really coming together as a region itself. And again, the example of the Lava Jato was there, but also I would say on the fintech industry. Fintech is booming in Mexico, is booming in Brazil, and even if these issues are still exist, those are is an industry that has an enormous potential, and it's also because the private sector and the public sector have worked together, regulators have worked together in figuring out how to have a spectrum that really allows for economic development and also for capital to come, the investment, also thinking about long-term investments and innovation. So I think just replicating by using these very positive examples that we already have is how we will really get to the other side and really have nearshoring as el new El Dorado coming up.
Santiago, in 1993, you led the work to draft Mexico's first antitrust legislation to regulate mergers and punish anti-competitive business practices. You also served as the first president of the Federal Competition Commission. What you did then, planning, and what is happening now, what did you do right? Where do you see things now?
We did some things right, and we did a lot of things wrong. We had a good law. We had a structure of a competition that was autonomous. We failed to understand that the power of these businesses was so large that through various legal means, the amparo, which is a law of stay, most of the resolutions of the Competition Commission would be neutralized or nullified because it would go to the judicial power, and then the tribunals did not know how to deal with this. Things have improved since then. So now the tribunals have specialized tribunals in competition, and we have specialized judges in competition, and there's now more movement. But my take in this last almost 30 years since I worked on this is that we're still far from the promise. We're far from the promise. The amount of gains that we had for consumers relative to the concentration of power and the concentration of rents that is occurring is still significantly imbalanced. And then we miss something that is very, very important, and that is in the report, and I want to highlight. If you read chapter 2 of the report, and you should read it, there's a very nice graph in chapter 2 that talks about Latin America being an area of the world in which there are some few large firms. This is what we've been talking about so far. And then there's a very large number of small firms, and nobody pays attention to that. So I want to just think of the following. Think of the market for bread, and think there are only two firms, equal size. One firm has 50% of the market, the other firm has 50% of the market. Maybe some kind of monopolistic arrangement, cozy monopolium, not a lot of innovation, like what Bill was saying, because there are two firms competing. Now, suppose exactly the same, there's one firm that has 50% of the market, and now there are zillions of very, very small firms making bread, each one with an almost infinitesimal share of the market, but when you sum them up, they have another 50% of the market. Now, this large firm pays taxes, pays minimum wages, complies with social security regulations, complies with all the laws. And these tiny set of firms don't pay minimum wages, don't pay taxes, don't comply with social security regulations. Nobody pays attention to them, because they're tiny, they're, mini little firms. But when you add them up, they have 50% of the market. Is that a competition problem? Would that be sanctioned by the law? If you read the Latin American laws on competition, none talk about unfair competition in the product market coming from the existence of a large number of firms, many of which will be subsidized by the government through microcredits, through special tax regimes, through whatnot. This is a part of the competition problem that the report brings out, and I want to highlight that because the report is a very nice way of saying this is another dimension of competition, and we haven't paid attention to that. One last point. Marcela and Bill talked about rent concentration. So again, go back to the bread example. Two monopolists or two duopolists, and they share rent somehow. If you have an effective antitrust law and you bring down prices, not only you do reduce rents, but you also increase the real wage. And in Latin America, we work all the time. We try to increase the real wage by raising minimum wages and by doing all these things, subsidizing this and that, which is extremely costly and distorting in other dimensions. But if we did effective competition, you could get the equivalent of an increase in the real wage without distorting the labor market, and with the additional bonus that you would improve the income distribution and reduce rents. So bottom line, there's a lot to be done in competition, but we have to widen our perspective of what competition is, to think about what's happening with this large segment of firms on the other side that nobody pays attention to, and then think about making authorities much more effective, because they indeed can bring about changes in efficiency and equity. Not many policies in Latin America can increase efficiency and equity at the same time. Competition is one of them.
How do you change the ship? How do you were saying very interesting things like you have to tax the mega rich, you have to have better regulation, you have to have strong authorities. When they look at the #1 economy in the world, it's going completely against that direction. There is more lobby, there is less taxing, and depending on what happens in November, they're promising less taxes. How do you do How do you take that sector into mind and bring them into this competitive market?
You bring the conversation to a difficult place related to how we build stronger social contracts in the region. How do we understand that the only way that we will have enough tax collection to invest in development is if we actually have working labor markets and output markets? And that's so. Sadly, I don't have the answer, but I think I want to say something that I hopefully sort of also responds to your question. We started talking about policy, and I don't know if we've said high enough that we have a problem of very low competition in most markets in the region. We have very high markups on average, and we're up there where the developed world is very worried that they are getting to. So we've always been there. That's the big concern, and it has to do with what Santiago was mentioning. We somehow have managed to survive with this very strange landscape of productive activity, whereby we have these giant firms on one extreme, and then a largely missing segment of small and medium firms, and a lot of people in tiny firms and self-employment. Part of what we have there is a story of 90% of the market, probably more, not being able to put any competition pressure on the firms that are at the very top. I don't know how the mindset changes, because I do think that in some of our countries we have a rentist mindset, and that's what we should be going against. Maybe Andrea can correct me, but I have the impression that in countries where competition authorities have been stronger and have more standing, there is a chip that starts changing. When I see Chilean firms operating in Colombia, my own country, they come with a different chip than our own companies. So I think it's a matter of political will, in a sense, the starting point.
And a relationship with power and how you deal with authority. A lot of Colombians here. Now, Leticia, there's also this angle that more authority, more control slows things down. And then it depends on how efficient that authority is or how well versed that authority is in what it's doing. So sometimes it could even hamper competitiveness.
Yes, and I think I will go to policy volatility, right? Like, one of the main issues for foreign investment is really not knowing what will happen, right? And you're seeing it. You saw it with Mexico with the energy reform, all the progress that it took to get to the energy reform and then the changes again. If you don't create that stability, then it gets even more complicated. So I think that will be really the incentive, because I believe that for the international players, they need to know when they are making a long-term investment, and some of the investments that we need are on infrastructure, which are long-term investments. You need to know that there will be the certainty, the legal certainty that it will be there, even if you have political changes. And that's why also the independence of all these authorities that we have been talking about is also so key.
Andrea, is there a cultural factor in this whole process? Because the way you describe things in Chile are a lot different. With Leticia was mentioning Lavallato. So is that also a factor that made your job easier, having a society that is more willing to comply with these rules?
No. I think as I said, I was like in the first 10 years of this new authority. So when we came in, as I tell you, most entrepreneurs thought that, doing cartels was business as usual. So I think it's a process. I mean, if the authority is effective, it starts to build in the society that these are wrong things to do. And I think that after these 20 years, we have achieved that in Chile. I mean, I'm not saying there are no cartels, but society doesn't accept them anymore. And so, and I want to touch on a couple of other issues. Of course, our political systems in Chile, we have, and this is very well touched in the report. Our political system in Chile has 24 political parties and growing. So politicians care, at best, they care about the next election, and they don't care about long-time welfare. So if you're going to present them a new law that will destroy one job, but that has the potentiality to create 1,000 other jobs, they will reject it just because of that one vote. I am exaggerating, but it's true. So, for example, we have discussing the cabotage rules, in the Congress forever. And they keep saying, no, we are going to lose a couple of jobs. And so we are a long country with a long coast, and we don't use it for transporting because we have a monopoly in cabotage. And I think it has to do with political structure, that no party really is sure it's going to be there in 5 years to respond to the policies they take. But other thing that I think is missing in the report, and I would stress it, is economies of scale. The technology has increased economies of scale in almost every market. So you cannot compare competition in Chile, in each Latin American country with a market like Europe or a market like United States. It's really unfair. And it's impossible to get to a level of competition with our island economies because we are really islands within Latin America. So first, I want to pledge to erase the graph 2.2 in the report, where where it's the depiction of the share of the GDP of the 50 largest firms. And of course, Chile looks 70% of the GDP in Chile is explained by the 50 largest firms. But we are 1/7 of Brazil economy, and we are 1/6 of Mexico economy. So that comparison put on the alarms where it shouldn't be, and given our very bad political, very low level political debate, that graph can lead to a change of policy, a very dangerous change of policy. So you have to be very careful in comparing countries because it has consequences.
I want to go, Andrea. Andrea, I want to interrupt you. I want to go to Santiago. When you read the report, the prognosis is that growth is going to be slow, very slow. Is there time to implement this? Is this something that can be done in the middle, in the long range? Is this mindset, can it be changed quickly enough for growth to be where it should be?
It takes time, but it's not so much a question of speed. It's a question of what Leticia was saying. It's a question of policy consistency. What you need is get a good competition law. It's not going to work well initially. You're going to make mistakes. Cases are going to bounce with the judicial power. It's going to take time. But little by little, you're going to build the capabilities within the government to do competition policy. And something that Andrea was saying, the changes in society such that this kind of behavior is not business as usual, but is no longer tolerated, such that political parties then reflect them into their platforms, and this becomes the law of the land. This process has been extremely difficult, and I want to illustrate it with something that is very sad, what's going on right now. So I started the Competition Commission about 25 years ago. In the previous administration of President Peña Nieto, there was a constitutional reform to actually strengthen it, policy continuity. During this administration, the president put forth a constitutional reform to actually close down the Competition Commission. So if you're trying to tell society this is an essential element of the way the economy should function, and if we want to be competitive, we need to have more competition, and in comes a policy reversal that says we're actually going to disappear this agency. This is, useless, not relevant. It's very, very difficult. So to come to your question, what's crucial is consistency, because it takes time. It's not going to deliver a 0.5% growth, increase in the growth rate in the very short run. But over time, it might just create conditions that will increase productivity, that then will increase the growth rate over time. And we haven't done the homework 25 years ago, and we're suffering it today compared to other regions of the world. So, whatever is past is past. But what is important, and that's the message of the report, is this is something that needs to be done, begin, or if you already started, have policy consistency and continue. The report brings out something very pedestrian but very important. You need to put money into this. These competition agencies, not only the Chilean one, they're scratching for pesos. The rate of return on this is huge. For a little bit of extra money, we're talking about $50 million, $100 million. The gains to consumers are huge. So they have to put more money into this, and Congresses have to increase their budget and just do it consistently.
I want to open up the floor. We've received questions from our viewers. The first one is from Marlene Ortiz. She's in Cajamarca, Peru. What is the importance of the education for the competition to competitiveness, unlocking growth and productivity in Latin American countries? Who wants to take that one? Education for this goal.
What's the importance of education? The report makes a very strong point of policy complementarity. We will not become more productive just by having working competition authorities if we don't push the levers in other directions. Human capital is for sure one of them, and we've been talking. Bill was talking about innovation, no? How we have to work on preparing firms to increase their firm level productivity in order to be actually prepared to compete in domestic markets and in foreign markets. So I would say the importance of education is that it's like the very base of productivity. It's what one of the very basic inputs that we put into any production function is our human capital. And as long as we lag in terms of human capital, we will be lagging in productivity, and we will be not able to face international competition. That's my connection to I don't know if that answers the question.
I will add just one point that was mentioned before, all the relationships that exist to really foster innovation through the universities and the private sector. That's key, and that needs to happen. It's happening at some scale in different countries, but it needs to happen in every country and every university.
I have another question. I want to start with Santiago. This is from Luis Fernando Peña. He says, corruption, especially in infrastructure, neutralizes the competitive advantages of countries and makes the use of nearshoring ineffective. What good practices are there to combat corruption in infrastructure?
Excellent question. $64,000 question. Pray to God. That's policy number one. Policy number two is you've got to clean procurement laws. You've got to be consistent with that. A lot of the infrastructure projects are government-led infrastructure projects, so procurement is central. Transparency helps. It doesn't go all the way, but transparency helps. And you just have to go at it and increase sanctions. Right now, the game for a lot of these people is, if I get caught, I'll be 2 days in the press. It'll be a little bit shameful, but 3 days later, somebody else will be in the press and people will forget, end of the story. What you need to do is spend 5 years in jail. And then that changes behavior. So we need to increase sanctions, and we need to be more credible in the sense that these kinds of behaviors are not tolerable. And we're not there yet. So that's why corruption continues.
Ferdous in touch, Fred says, excited for Copa America this month, vamos Argentina. So, Andrea, this question is for you. It says, beyond just competition between firms, what role can regional cooperation play in boosting overall competitiveness for Latin American countries? Are there specific areas where collaboration could have a significant impact? The question is from Mohammed Abdurrahman.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think as I said, economies of scale makes our market, especially Chile, which I think is the smallest market, impossible to compete. I mean, we cannot have many companies if the economies of scale are increasing and the optimal size of each company is very large, maybe larger than our market. So cooperation, I wouldn't say cooperation, I would say straight integration. And that doesn't mean to be protectionism. Protectionist, we are far away from the large markets. So we are already protected by the distance. So what I mean is more integration, like infrastructure, customs, many things that we have to go to the details, and maybe start thinking of regional markets, like for energy, for example. Europe has a European market for energy, the United States, of course, and mobile phone, transportation, air transportation is very balkanized in Latin America. We don't give each other permissions for frequent flights. I mean, there is so much to go in the road of integrating our markets to really be using those economies of scale to lower prices, to increase competition. And I know I'm daydreaming. I mean, I don't see, I mean, it's as difficult as, I don't know which is more difficult, Latin American integration or improving our education.
So
And
we
I
have-
want to say
couple
one
minutes.
thing about education,
Yes.
please, if you let me.
Please, be quick.
Yes, we have, if you compare lower education levels in Italy, Spain, and Chile, they are almost the same. 35% of the people have lower education levels. But if you go to real skills, I mean, ability to read, ability to use some mathematical skill, Chilean percentage go twice as much. It's 70% of the people don't know how to read, how to understand, or how to do basic mathematic operations. And in Italy and in Spain, it keeps being 35%. I mean, those who have lower education have lower skills. So we are not talking only about the level of education, we are talking about quality of education.
We have 1 minute left. Marcela, how optimistic are you that you're sounding the alarm? Are we paying attention? Are the people that have to pay attention listening?
We need everyone to amplify the messages. I think people are not, and historically have not been paying enough attention to the potential that we'd have if we were able to have markets that actually work properly. We have in the report a few examples. There are not so many examples that we have been able to quantify, but we have some good examples of what can happen when competition institutions actually work well in terms of the impact on productivity, the impact on wages, the impact on the working of markets, and the impact on overall welfare. So this is a concern, the fact that markets are extremely concentrated. And let me say this, it's not that we worry about having large firms. We actually want to have large firms. We just don't want them to misbehave. We don't want them to have more rents that come from misbehavior. We want more firms to be able to grow, and want these big firms that we have to allow other firms to actually enter the market and participate. The message is not loud enough. This is why we keep sort of trying to point at it. And there are, we think, low-hanging fruits in terms of things that can be done and that only really require political will and not so much spending resources or anything to start.
Leticia, are you as optimistic as you were when we started?
Yes, I'm still very optimistic. Look, we have the natural resources, we have the Amazonas, so there is no reason why not to. And I completely agree. Like what's happening in Mexico, we should all be very concerned about it and really voice our concern.
Santiago, what do you tell the folks here and the folks watching us? What is the main point they should pay attention to and do something about?
read the report, and competition sounds a trite, but we have a region of the world in which we have a market economy that doesn't deliver the benefits of a market economy. And it's extremely frustrating for people. A lot of the political dysfunctionality that we see in the region comes from the fact that people equate market economy equal privilege, market economy equal concentration of power. And then we have all sorts of experiments all over the place, no policy consistency. If we had functioning market economies, eventually our politics would be less dysfunctional.
Santiago Levy, Leticia Osa Daza, Andrea Butelman, Marcela Melendez, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.